This is Winchester Cathedral, and buried within its walls are the bones of one of the most despised kings England has seen, William II. So join me on a voyage through William's life and demise to find out exactly how he ended up in there. William II, who ruled from September the 26th, 1087 until his passing in 1100, was William the Conqueror's third son. William Rufus, now being the name by which he is more frequently known, Rufus being the Latin meaning for red, was rumoured to have red hair and a ruddy appearance as a youngster. However, now it is believed that his red hair probably grew out later in life. William's precise birth date is uncertain, although it was probably around 1058. The other sons were Henry, Richard and Robert. He was born to William the Conqueror and Matilda of Flanders. Around the year 1075, Richard was killed in the New Forest while hunting, a dangerous hobby as we'll hear more about later on. Robert received Normandy upon the death of William's father in 1087. However, William became King of England. William the Conqueror may have had up to 6 daughters. However, there is far stronger proof for just the presence of 4. Adeliza and Matilda's existence is much less definite. There is evidence to support the fact that as they were growing up, William I's 3 surviving sons often fought. For example, the English chronicler Orderic Vitalis wrote describing an altercation between the 3 brothers whereby William and Henry humiliated their brother Robert by emptying a chamber pot onto Robert's head from an upper gallery. Their father had to intervene to restore order after a fight broke out. As a young man, William Rufus was described as being, and I quote, well set, not very tall, and had rather a large belly. This was an account by William of Malmesbury, who was regarded as the foremost English historian of the 12th century. We'll hear more about him later on. Near the end of 1086, William the Conqueror left England. In order to forward his strategy of finding friends to oppose the French kings, he arranged the marriage of his daughter Constance to Duke Alan of Brittany after returning to the continent. In July 1087, William conducted an expedition against the French under the leadership of his son Robert, who was still associated with the French king. Robert appears to have been actively inciting unrest. William the Conqueror probably became ill or was injured when seizing Mons. He was subsequently transported to Rouen, where he passed away on September the 9th, 1087. Given the expectation that he would succeed as king, William the Conqueror gave his second surviving son, William Rufus, custody of England and left Normandy to Robert. Henry, the youngest son, just received cash. William's father dispatched William back to England on September the 7th or 8th after handing over control of the country to his second son, ordering the Archbishop of Canterbury, Lanfranc, to support the new monarch. William II began to consult and confide in Lanfranc. William Rufus was then crowned on September the 26th, 1087. For those nobility who had property on both sides of the English Channel, the separation of William the Conqueror's lands and possessions into two parts provided a significant problem. These nobles were concerned that they could not possibly hope to please both of their lords, and hence ran the risk of alienating one or both of them, because the younger William and his brother Robert were natural rivals. They believed that reunifying England and Normandy under a single monarch was the only option. They rebelled against William in favour of Robert in the rebellion of 1088, led by the able Bishop Odo of Bayeux, William the Conqueror's half-brother. However, Robert failed to travel to England, and therefore the attempt to organise his allies was unsuccessful, so William persuaded the English to back him by bribing them with silver and lofty promises of better governance. By crushing the insurrection, he also solidified his hold on power. William invaded Normandy in 1091, destroying Robert's army and compelling him to cede some of his domains. Nevertheless, the two brothers soon made amends, and William vowed to aid Robert in regaining regions that France had taken from him. Although this plan was ultimately scrapped, William remained fiercely warlike to the very last, defending his French possessions and interests. In his dominion, William now felt secure. His bishops and abbots were obligated to him by feudal obligations, just as they were in Normandy. At this time, there was a conflict throughout medieval Europe between the church and the state regarding who had the authority to appoint bishops and abbots. These reforms were known as the Gregorian reforms and were started by Pope Gregory VII. Prior to these reforms, the Church was a highly decentralised organisation, and the Pope's authority was limited to that of the Bishop of Rome. These reforms changed all of that, and they led to the Church's battle with many of the heads of state throughout Europe. Because William unified the realm through his rule and law, the Pope was now far less likely to condemn him. William's reign lasted less than 2 years when Lanfranc, the Archbishop of Canterbury, passed away. William put off appointing a new archbishop for a number of years after Lanfranc's passing. During this time he appropriated church funds, increasing his wealth. However, in 1093 he fell severely ill and feared he was about to die. In a moment of panic, William appointed Anselm, an Italian Benedictine monk who was widely regarded as the finest theologian of his century, as the next archbishop. However, Anselm was a stronger advocate of the Gregorian reforms in the church than Lanfranc was during his lifetime. Antagonism between the church and the state resulted from this for quite some time. William and Anselm clashed on a number of ecclesiastical matters, and, as a result, the king frequently expressed his rage to Anselm. The English clergy, who depended on the monarch for their livelihood and well-being, were unable to publicly back Anselm. William convened a council in 1095 with the intention of coercing Anselm into submission. But the archbishop was incredibly obstinate and stuck to his guns. Anselm voluntarily went into exile in October 1097 and took his case to the Pope. New Pope Urban II unquestionably erred on the side of diplomacy. Being at odds already with Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, Urban was hesitant to gain yet another foe. Thus, Urban and William reached a consensus in which Urban accepted the Anglo-Norman ecclesiastical status quo, and William recognised Urban as Pope. Anselm chose to stay in exile rather than return to England, which allowed William to continue collecting the Archbishop of Canterbury's income up to the end of his reign. Now, one of the reasons William has received a bad reputation throughout history is because of his opposition to the church. However, this conflict was not unique to medieval English politics. Consider, for example, the assassination of Thomas Becket under the rule of Henry II, and then Henry VIII's conflicts with the church centuries later. Therefore, this confrontation between William and the church was definitely not a unique occurrence. William Rufus may have lacked some of the charisma and political savvy of his father, which made him less successful in containing the Norman lords' tendency for revolt, but he was incredibly forceful in overcoming these inadequacies. For example, in 1095 the Royal Council, which was held 3 times annually and was where the king communicated his policy decisions to the great lords, was where Robert de Mowbray, the Earl of Northumbria, made a huge mistake as he failed to attend. Robert Mowbray was overpowered by an army William led and stripped of his property and possessions and jailed. Also, William of Eu, another noble, was accused of betraying them and ended up being castrated and blinded for his troubles. William had some success on foreign affairs. King Malcolm III of Scotland attempted to invade in 1091, but he was defeated and Malcolm was forced to submit and acquiesce to William's rule. William then constructed Carlisle Castle in 1092, seizing possessions of the Scottish claimed lands of Cumberland and Westmoreland. However, following a dispute between the two kings about Malcolm's holdings in England, Malcolm once more invaded, plundering Northumbria. Robert de Mowbray's Norman soldiers attacked Malcolm at the Battle of Alnwick on November the 13th, 1093. Following the deaths of Malcolm and his son Edward, Donald, Malcolm's brother, ascended to the throne. William backed Malcolm's son Duncan II, who briefly held power and afterwards supported Edgar, another of Malcolm's sons. Edgar Etheling led a war that resulted in the conquest of Lothian in 1094 and the final removal of Donald with William's assistance. The new monarch acknowledged William's rule over Lothian and subsequently appeared at William's court. The original Westminster Hall, today known as the Houses of Parliament, was started by William in 1097 with the intention of impressing his subjects with the strength and majesty of his authority. Also, William Rufus's sexuality is one of the topics that receives the greatest attention. He was never married and never had any children, either legally or illegally. As a result, many at the time and more recently questioned his sexual orientation. It has been a regular source of debate, with some speculating that he was homosexual because there was no proof of his impotence or infertility. That being said, other than the notion that he allegedly surrounded himself with attractive long-haired men, there is little to no evidence to suggest that William was homosexual. Whilst William's sexual orientation is a contentious topic, there isn't much evidence to back up either side of the argument. However, the church would have benefited greatly from these allegations of sodomy, as it was extremely incensed and offended by William's authority, just as we've discussed earlier. King William II of England passed away on the 2nd of August 1100. An arrow to the chest claimed William's life. William of Malmesbury again records the specifics of his death. About 20 years after the king's death, he penned his book, The History of the English Kings. Malmesbury doesn't seem to have much time for the monarch. He intimates that William deserved it, adding that Rufus is perceived as deficient in piety and morality, gorging himself especially on lust and alcohol. Since chroniclers were frequent churchgoers, they did not view William favourably. Malmesbury laments the king's disdain for God and lists all the ominous signs that pointed to the king's demise. In the year of the king's passing, according to Malmesbury, the devil appeared to men in the woods, and the spring in the Berkshire village of Hampstead ran red for more than 2 weeks. When he heard this, Rufus allegedly just laughed. However, William took the prophecies more seriously when they were directed specifically against him. In his dream, the king saw a spurt of blood shoot into the heavens, blocking out the sun and ushering in the night. When he awoke, he insisted on having his staff keep watch over him because he wouldn't sleep in the dark. A monk had another frightening dream the same night. Malmesbury portrays the king in a quite depraved light when he describes how the monarch entered a church looking scornfully about the crowd with his usual haughty and insolent demeanour. Then, apparently, he grabbed the crucifix and began to chew on the figure's limbs and legs. Malmesbury used this to emphasise the king's demonic ideas as the figure fought back and kicked the king away, who fell back as flames shot from his mouth. The monarch then started feasting and drank to calm his anxious thoughts. He then set out on his tragic journey into the New Forest with friends. Unrelatedly, Richard, his older brother, had similarly perished in a hunting accident in the New Forest over 30 years before. They continued deeper into the forest. The group then dispersed. Walter Tyrrell was the only person left with the king. A stag was the next target for the monarch, who only succeeded in wounding it. William had to cover his eyes as he watched it run because of the sun. Tyrrell fired at a different stag, and at this very moment he, according to Malmesbury, fired his fatal arrow into the chest of the king without knowing it and without being able to stop it. The king then fell upon his wound, thus speeding up his demise. As soon as he realised the monarch was dead, Tyrrell swiftly left the area, thus raising suspicion. None of the other party members went after him. He was accused by some whilst at the same time being pitied by others. Their focus rapidly shifted from their deceased ruler to his successor. They didn't even bother taking the king's body with them, as this was left behind in the forest. Later, some townspeople picked up the body of William and carried it to Winchester Cathedral. There, 3 days later, William was buried quietly, with little ceremony and no grieving. Such was the public's dislike of William. Following the incident, the alleged assassin, Walter Tyrrell, fled to France, which many have come to interpret as an admission of guilt over time. But at the time, hunting was not a very safe or well-managed activity. Tragic hunting accidents happened often. The simple fact that Tyrrell had killed the King of England, even if unintentionally, may have been the only factor in his flight. Fratricide was also regarded as a particularly horrible crime that, if even a word of it had spread throughout the nation, this would have damaged the new King Henry's power right from the start. Meanwhile, his brother Henry was quicker to act than the rest of the king's household. Henry rode hard to Winchester and crowned himself Henry I. By right, his brother Robert of Normandy should have received the throne, but after Henry had taken control of the royal coffers and had himself crowned king, Robert had no chance. Henry received the backing of the most powerful nobility, and eventually the two brothers inevitably fought, but Henry won the day. One issue that has perplexed historians is where did the king's tragic hunting accident occur? Well, apparently here. The Rufus stone here in the New Forest depicts the alleged spot for where William II met his demise. However, some historians contend that the actual death site is much nearer to Beaulieu Abbey, a few miles further south. The original stone was erected in 1745 by John Lord Delaware. This stone here is a replacement for the old stone, is made of iron and erected in 1841. Part of the inscription reads as follows: "Here stood the oak tree on which an arrow shot by Sir Walter Tyrrell at a stag glanced and struck King William II, surnamed Rufus, on the breast, of which he instantly died." Well, you join me back here in Winchester. Let us pause for a few moments and take a look around this beautiful cathedral. Here you can see the tomb where William was initially placed. The area where William's body was first buried collapsed, many believing that this was God's revenge for allowing the burial of the despised William in the cathedral in the first place, and nothing to do with substandard workmanship in that part of the building. Subsequently, William's body was buried along with several other English kings and noblemen within these walls here. At the end of all this, we can only conclude that there is much ambiguity about the life and times of William II. Was he killed by his brother Henry I? Was he homosexual, and was he really as bad a king as history suggests? One positive in William's favour is that the army most definitely gave William the respect and backing that he lacked from the church. Given that Norman lords had a history of uprisings and rebellions, he was proven as an expert tactician and military commander who recognised the need of having his army's devotion. Although he used force to keep his nobles in order, he was unable to completely curb their secular ambitions. Well, anyway, I do hope that you have enjoyed this voyage through William II's life. If so, please like and subscribe if you would like to see more content like this. So, until next time, bye for now.